Wyoming Territory, August Montgomery Ranch, high noon. The branding iron was 2 feet from Hannah's face. 40 men watched. Not one moved. "You are mine," Sterling said quietly. "You have always been mine." Hannah looked at every single face. Then her voice cut through the heat like a blade. "Please, somebody, help me." Silence, then bang. The iron exploded in a shower of sparks. Over the ridge, a black stallion came down, hard rider low, twin revolvers out, 40 men scattering like dust. He pulled up beside her, scar-jaw to cheekbone, gray eyes steady as stone. He didn't ask, just reached down. She grabbed his arm, and they were gone. "Who are you?" "Jesse Walker." Just a name, except everybody in the territory knew that name. The Ghost. One shot changed everything. Don't miss what comes next. The branding iron glowed orange in the forge. Hannah Miller could feel the heat from 10 feet away. It pulsed against her face like a second sun, and the smell iron, coal, and something sickeningly close to scorched flesh turned her stomach. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her wrists were raw from the rope. Her knees had hit the dirt so many times since dawn that she'd stopped counting. August in Wyoming Territory was no mercy. The sun pressed down on the Montgomery Ranch yard like a flat, heavy hand, and the dust that rose from 40 pairs of boots had nowhere to go. It just hung there, thick and still. 40 men. She'd counted them. Twice. Some leaned against fence posts with their thumbs hooked in their belts. Some sat on hay bales like they were watching a traveling show. A few stood in loose clusters near the barn door, arms crossed, faces blank. Not one of them shifted. Not one of them looked away. Sterling Montgomery stood at the center of it all. He was dressed well too well for a ranch yard in the middle of summer. Cream-colored shirt, freshly pressed. Silver watch chain catching the light. He had the kind of face that looked trustworthy at a distance and wrong up close, with pale eyes that never quite matched whatever expression he was wearing. Right now, he was wearing patience. The calculated kind. "You thought you could run?" he said. He wasn't raising his voice. He never raised his voice. "You thought you could take what belongs to me and just disappear into the hills." He walked a slow half-circle around Hannah. His boots barely made a sound. The ledger. He stopped in front of her. "Where is it?" Hannah said nothing. He studied her for a moment, then turned away like she'd already bored him. He nodded once toward the forge. One of his men, broad-shouldered, leather gloves, eyes like 2 flat stones, reached for the iron. Hannah's breath locked in her chest. The M at the end of the brand caught the light as the man lifted it free. Beautiful, almost, the way the metal glowed, the way the heat bent the air around it. Sterling had designed it himself. That was the rumor, anyway, that he'd drawn the shape on paper himself and handed it to the blacksmith with a smile. "You are mine," Sterling said quietly, turning back to face her. "You have been mine since the day your father signed that contract. When he died, the debt passed to you. When your fool husband died, it passed to you again." He tilted his head. "That is how it works. That is how it has always worked." 2 men grabbed her arms, hard. They wrenched them behind her back, and Hannah bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. She would not give him that. She had decided that somewhere around the 2nd day of captivity, whatever he took from her, he would not get her voice breaking for him. The man with the gloves stepped forward. The iron was 4 feet away now. 3. The heat was extraordinary. It pushed against her cheek like a fist. Hannah looked at the crowd. She looked at all 40 of them, one face at a time. A few glanced away. One young one near the back, couldn't have been more than 19, was staring at his own boots like they held some answer he needed. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The iron was 2 feet away. She thought of the ledger tucked into the canyon wall. She thought of the women whose names filled those pages. Debt after debt, fabricated from thin air, enforced by men with guns. She thought of Mary Holt, who'd worked Sterling's kitchen for 3 years, trying to pay off a number that only ever grew. She thought of Clara Sims, who'd wept into her hands at Evelyn's table and said she didn't even understand what she'd signed. She thought of all of it, and then she stopped thinking. Please help me. It came out of her plainly. Not a scream, not a sob, just a voice human and clear, cutting through the heat and the silence and the space between 40 men who'd made themselves into furniture. Please, somebody, help me. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the shot came. Bang! It cracked across the yard like the sky had split open. The branding iron exploded from the man's grip in a spray of orange sparks and twisted metal. The henchman stumbled backward with a shout, shaking his gloved hand. The iron hit the dirt 6 feet away and lay there, still glowing, faintly, useless. Silence. Then the ridge above the ranch broke wide open. He came down the slope at a dead run, a black stallion moving like something that had never learned the word slow. The rider sat low and steady, one hand on the reins, and the first thing Hannah registered clearly was the twin revolvers, both out, both level, moving from target to target, with the quiet certainty of a man who had done this more times than she could imagine. The 40 men scattered, not all at once. A few of Sterling's braver hires raised their rifles, and the rider put shots in the dirt at their feet, without breaking stride, not killing. Not yet, just making a very clear argument. The argument worked. Men dove behind troughs and fence posts. Someone's hat went flying. The young one near the back ran straight into the barn and didn't come out. Sterling's voice cut through it all, sharp and furious. Shoot him! Somebody shoot him! But the black stallion was already in the yard, and the rider had already decided how this was going to go. He pulled up hard beside her, the horse sliding to a stop, in a curtain of dust. Up close, he was bigger than he'd looked on the ridge, broad through the shoulders, with a pale scar that ran jaw to cheekbone on the left side of his face. He wore a worn brown poncho and a hat pulled low, and his eyes, when they found hers, were a very steady shade of gray. He didn't ask if she wanted to come. He reached down. Hannah grabbed his arm and swung up behind the saddle before she'd even finished deciding to. Her hands found his waist. The horse was already moving. The rifle fire started in earnest then. She heard the shots hitting the fence post they passed, heard the dirt kicking up behind the horse's hooves, heard Sterling screaming something she didn't catch. A bullet clipped the top of the fence rail to their left and sent a chunk of wood spinning past her ear. She ducked her head and held on. The black stallion hit the open trail at the edge of the property and opened up completely, and the sound of pursuit fell behind them in stages. First, the shouting, then the individual rifle cracks, then just the general thunder of panic they were leaving in their wake. By the time they reached the first tree line, the ranch was half a mile back. Hannah realized she was shaking. She became aware of it gradually, like waking up. Her hands on the stranger's sides were trembling, and her jaw ached from how hard she'd been clenching it. The rope burns on her wrists had started bleeding again from the effort of swinging up. The rider slowed the horse to a canter as they moved deeper into the pines. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. The trees thickened around them, and the brutal August sun broke into scattered pieces of light through the canopy. Somewhere above, a bird called once and went quiet. The horse's breathing steadied. Finally, he spoke, without turning around. "You hurt? Nothing that won't keep," Hannah said. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been something closer to relief. Hard to tell. She looked back through the trees. No sign of riders yet. Sterling would come. She knew that with complete certainty. He would reorganize, throw money at the problem, and come. Men like him didn't accept a yard full of witnesses to their humiliation. He would burn the county down before he let this stand. But right now, in this specific moment, she was upright and breathing, and moving away from a branding iron with an M on it. She looked at the back of the stranger's scarred jaw, the man who'd fired one shot from a ridge, scattered 40 men, and pulled her up without a word. "Who are you?" she asked. The pines swallowed them deeper. "Jesse Walker," he said. He said it like it was just a name, like it didn't mean anything. But she'd heard it before. Everybody in the territory had heard it. The ghost. The cabin sat below ground level. That was the first thing Hannah noticed when Jesse led the stallion down a narrow earthen ramp concealed behind a curtain of hanging willow branches. The structure was built into a hillside, half swallowed by the earth itself, with a sod roof that had actual grass growing out of it. From 20 feet away, you'd walk right past it. From 50 feet, it didn't exist. Jesse dropped from the saddle and tied the horse to an iron ring bolted into the hillside. He pushed the door open and stepped back without a word. Hannah slid down on her own. Her legs nearly went out from under her when she hit the ground. 2 days without food, without real sleep, and now the shaking that comes after fear finally lets go. She caught the doorframe with one hand and stood there for a second, waiting for her knees to decide they were going to cooperate. Jesse watched her. He didn't reach out to steady her. She got the sense he understood that she didn't want that yet. She straightened and walked inside. The cabin was one room. Small, low, ceilinged, smelling of pine resin and old wood smoke. A narrow cot against one wall. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A stone fireplace barely large enough to fit both of Hannah's fists inside. A shelf held tins of food, a folded wool blanket, a box of ammunition, and a battered tin coffee pot. A single oil lantern hung from a ceiling hook on a short length of chain. It was clean, though. Deliberately clean. The kind of place that gets maintained out of habit. Jesse ducked through the door behind her and went straight to the fireplace. He knelt and struck a match. While the kindling caught, he rose and went to the shelf, filled a small pot with water from a covered bucket on the floor, and set it over the growing flames. Hannah sat down in one of the chairs. Now that the moving was done, her wrists made themselves impossible to ignore. The rope had been coarse and had been on too long and too tight, and the skin beneath was a mess chafed raw in long strips, broken open in a few places. Dried blood cracking every time she flexed her fingers. She held them in her lap and looked at them with the detached expression of someone trying to assess damage without feeling it. Jesse came and crouched in front of her. He had a piece of clean cloth and the pot of water, which had warmed quickly over the lively little fire. He didn't ask permission. He just set the pot on the floor between them, dipped the cloth, and wrung it most of the way out. "Hold still," he said. He pressed the warm cloth to her right wrist with remarkable gentleness for someone with hands that large. Hannah watched his face while he worked. He was focused, brow drawn slightly together, methodical. The scar on his jaw caught the firelight. Up close, she could see it ran all the way back behind his ear. He didn't rush. He cleaned the left wrist the same way, slow and thorough, rinsing the cloth twice. When he was done, he tore a second piece of cloth into strips and wrapped both wrists with a neatness that suggested he'd done field bandaging before. He tied each one off with 2 half hitches. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at her. "Thank you," Hannah said. He nodded once and stood. He put the pot back near the fire, then went to the shelf and opened one of the tins. Beans. He set a small pan over the fire without ceremony and started heating them. And Hannah realized she had no idea what to do with herself in the presence of simple, unhurried competence after 2 days of pure terror. "The ledger," she said. He glanced back at her. "Sterling's ledger. He thinks I had it on me when his men caught me." She watched Jesse's face. "I didn't." Jesse turned back to the pan, stirring slowly. "Canyon Trail. About 4 miles north of the Montgomery property line. There's a limestone face with a long, horizontal crack running through it at chest height. The crack goes back about 18 inches. I wrapped the ledger in oilskin and pushed it all the way to the back wall." He was quiet for a moment. "You stashed it during the escape." "I knew if they caught me, they'd search me. And they did." She looked at her wrists thoroughly. He set the spoon down and turned around fully. He studied her for a moment with those steady gray eyes. "You kept your head." "I kept the ledger," she said. "That's what matters." He gave a short nod, and she couldn't be entirely sure, but she thought something in his expression shifted. Not much. Just slightly. He ladled beans into a tin bowl and set it on the table in front of her with a spoon and a piece of hardtack. He poured water into a cup and put that down too. Then he pulled the other chair around and sat across from her and ate his own bowl, standing at the shelf, because there was simply nowhere else to stand. Hannah ate. She forced herself to go slow, though every instinct pushed the other direction. The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the pine tops. "Jesse Walker," she said between spoonfuls. He looked up. "I've heard stories. Most of them end with you killing somebody. Most stories do," he said. "The one about Laredo, the bank. Exaggerated." "Which part?" "The part where I walked out with $12,000 and a woman on each arm." He picked up his cup. "It was 8,000 and one woman. She was 73, and I carried her groceries to her wagon." Hannah looked at him for a beat, and then she laughed. It surprised her. It came out short and a little rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while, which was accurate enough. Jesse didn't smile exactly, but the line of his shoulders eased. She ate the rest of her beans. The fire settled into a low, steady burn. The lantern on its chain barely swayed. She set the bowl down and folded her bandaged hands on the table. "Why were you at the Montgomery Ranch today?" He took his time answering. He set his own bowl on the shelf and came back to the table and sat down properly this time. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "My sister," he finally said. Her name was Clara. She was 22. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "She went to Colorado looking for work. 5 years ago this coming November. Ended up on a property outside Durango. Man named Price ran it. He had a scheme. Signed people onto labor contracts with inflated interest clauses buried in the fine print. If they couldn't read well enough to catch it, and most couldn't, they signed their own freedom away and never knew it until the debt kept growing no matter how long they worked." He stopped. Hannah didn't push him. "She wrote me letters for a while. Then the letters stopped. By the time I got down to Durango and found out what Price's operation actually was." He set the cup down. "She was gone. Fever, they said. Overworked, underfed, no medical care. Gone. The fire was the only sound for a while. I dealt with Price," Jesse said flatly. "That's a story that ends the way you'd think. But it didn't bring her back." He looked at the fire. "There are more Prices, more Montgomerys. That's what I figured out afterward. Getting rid of one doesn't fix the system. It just makes a vacancy." Hannah looked at him. "So you came to Wyoming." I'd been tracking Sterling's operation for 8 months, piecing it together. From rumors, from women who'd escaped his properties and ended up in other towns. He's careful. He keeps everything in that ledger because he trusts paper more than people." He looked at her directly. "I was trying to figure out how to get to that ledger when you got there first." "I had more motivation," Hannah said. "Your father's contract. My father signed something he didn't understand. He wasn't educated. Sterling's man came out to the farm and talked very smoothly for 2 hours and put a pen in my father's hand. And my father signed because he was too proud to admit he couldn't read half the words on the page." Her voice stayed level. She'd made peace with this particular grief a long time ago, or at least she'd built a working arrangement with it. The debt was structured to be unpayable. Payments reduced the principal, but not fast enough to outrun the compounding interest. My father worked for 3 years and died, owing more than when he started. Jesse said nothing. He listened the way some people did, with his full attention and no attempt to fill the silences. "My husband Daniel took on the debt when we married. He thought he was protecting me. He thought he could negotiate with Sterling man to man." She shook her head. "Daniel died of a riding accident 18 months later. Sterling's men found me within the week. Very polite, very regretful. Presented me with a bill." She looked at the table. 5 years of my life in that kitchen and those fields. 5 years of watching other women in the same trap. And the whole time that ledger sat in Sterling's office. She met Jesse's eyes. I learned to read it. Took me 8 months of reading whatever scraps of paper I could find, practicing at night by firelight, asking questions without letting anyone know why I was asking. When I finally understood what was in that book, I understood everything. Jesse looked at her steadily. Then he said, "Ink and paper can draft an agreement, but not all the money in this territory has the right to buy a person's dignity or soul." It hit her somewhere solid, not because it was surprising, but because it was exact the thing she'd believed through all 5 years, the thing she'd held onto like a handhold on a cliff face, finally said out loud by another person. "No," she said quietly, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a while. Outside, the pines moved in the dark wind. The horse shifted on its feet and was still again. Jesse added a small log to the fire, and the flames rose briefly, casting long shadows up the earthen walls. Hannah's eyes were getting heavy. She fought it for another few minutes before she stopped fighting it. "Sleep," Jesse said. He nodded toward the cot. "I'll keep watch." She didn't argue. She pulled the wool blanket over herself and was asleep before she'd finished the thought that she was trusting a former outlaw with her life, and finding, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was completely at peace with that fact. Jesse Walker pulled his chair to face the door, set his revolvers on the table within easy reach, and sat in the firelight listening to the Wyoming night. He'd come a long way from Durango. He wasn't close to done yet. Morning came in gray, then gold. Hannah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Jesse outside with the horse, moving quietly. She sat up, rolled her shoulders, and looked at her bandaged wrists. The throbbing had settled overnight into something more manageable. She flexed her fingers carefully. Better. She got up and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the hearth and stood in the cabin doorway with it. Jesse was brushing the stallion down with long, even strokes, talking to the horse in a low voice. The animal stood with its ears half rotated toward him, apparently listening. "There's hardtack on the shelf," he said, without looking up. "I see it." She leaned against the doorframe. "What's the horse's name?" "Smoke." She looked at the animal, which was black as char from nose to tail. "That's not an obvious choice." "He runs like smoke," Jesse said. "Fast and quiet, and gone before you know it was there." Hannah drank her coffee and watched Smoke accept this explanation with dignified silence. They ate quickly, packed what little was worth taking from the cabin, and were moving within the hour. Jesse rode. Hannah rode behind him with her arms around his waist, and the morning air coming cold off the higher elevations, cutting through her thin dress in a way that made her jaw ache. "Sterling will have riders on every trail by now," she said. "The main trails," Jesse agreed. "That's why we're not taking them." What they were taking, instead, was a deer path so narrow that pine branches brushed both of Hannah's shoulders simultaneously. Smoke picked his way along it with the calm competence of an animal that had spent considerable time in territory no respectable horse would volunteer for. The ground was soft enough to muffle hoofbeats. They moved through the forest like a rumor. The canyon came into view around mid-morning. Red Canyon was aptly named. The limestone walls ran a deep rust color where iron deposits bled through the rock, and the whole formation narrowed as you moved north into a pass barely wide enough for two horses abreast. The walls rose 60, 70 feet on either side. The sky above was a thin strip of blue, the sun reaching the canyon floor only in the middle of the day. It was beautiful, the way that places indifferent to human life often were. "The crack in the limestone face," Hannah said. "It's about a quarter-mile into the pass." North wall. Jesse stopped Smoke at the canyon mouth and looked up at the walls for a long time. Hannah looked too. She saw what he was seeing, or she tried to. High ground on both sides. Narrow corridor below, one entrance and one exit, both visible from the heights. Any competent rifleman with high ground could cover every inch of this pass. "You want to wait," she said. "I want to think," he said. He was still looking at the canyon walls. "The ledger has been there since yesterday morning. Sterling's men have had time to backtrack your escape route. I didn't go through the canyon during the escape. I came down the western slope. Sterling has 40 men and a $2,000 motivation," Jesse said. "At least some of them can read sign well enough to find a hiding spot." Hannah's stomach dropped. We need to move fast. We move fast and quiet. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. If something goes wrong in there, don't wait for me to tell you what to do. React to what you see. You understand? Yes. He turned back to the canyon mouth. Stay close, they went in. The walls closed around them. The sounds changed immediately. Inside their own movements echoed softly, every shifted stone amplified and bounced, and the world outside the canyon reduced to a distant abstraction. It was cooler in here by 15 degrees. Hannah could hear water somewhere below, a thin trickle running in the deeper shadows at the base of the eastern wall. She counted paces out of habit. 200. The north wall had a long, nearly horizontal fracture running through its face at chest height, exactly as she'd described. The crack stretched for 6 or 8 feet before pinching closed, and at its deepest point, hidden in shadow. The oilskin package sat exactly where she'd pushed it. Jessie held Smoke still while Hannah slid off and crossed the canyon floor in 12 quick steps. She reached into the crack without hesitating, fingers finding the slick surface of the oilskin, and pulled the ledger free. It came out trailing a little dust. She turned it over in her hands, unwrapped one corner, confirmed the pages were dry and intact, and rewrapped it. She looked up at Jessie. He was looking up. She heard it a half-second after he did, the sharp, distinct click of a rifle hammer being drawn back. Then another, then a third. Not one, not two. 3 positions. High on the eastern wall, at least 2 more on the western side. She couldn't see the barrels, but she could feel them. Miss Miller. The voice came from above, unhurried and satisfied. A heavy-set man in a brown canvas coat, perched on a ledge 20 feet up the eastern wall, rifle braced on a flat stone. Sterling's tracker, she recognized the coat. That package belongs to Mr. Montgomery. Set it down, please. Jessie's revolvers were out. She didn't see him draw. They were simply out, both of them, his eyes moving from point to point across the canyon walls with the systematic efficiency of a man calculating odds. There's a Winchester on the saddle, he said to her, quietly, without moving his lips much. Left side scabbard. She looked at Smoke. The rifle handle was right there. Put the guns down, Walker, the tracker said. You're covered from 5 positions. That's not bravado. That's arithmetic. Set them down, Hannah, Jessie said. She crossed to the horse and pulled the Winchester out of the scabbard in one smooth motion. It was lever action, .44 caliber, and heavier than it looked. She had used her father's rifle at age 11 to keep coyotes off their chickens and had not fired one since. Her hands remembered. She worked the lever. The sharp, metallic clack-clack of the mechanism filled the canyon and bounced off both walls simultaneously. Everything happened at once. Jessie opened fire on the 2 western positions, moving Smoke laterally to break the angle, shots precise and fast, not trying to hit men behind cover, but striking rock faces to force heads down. Hannah swung the Winchester to the eastern wall and put a shot 2 feet left of the tracker's head, close enough that he jerked back hard from the ledge. She worked the lever and fired again before he'd recovered, this time aimed at the rock shelf supporting his rifle. The tracker pulled back. His rifle scraped against stone. Jessie wheeled Smoke and fired twice more at a position further back up the western wall, and the answering rifle cracked and went silent. Not because Jessie had hit the man, she thought, but because the man had decided the arithmetic had changed. Move, Jessie said. She ran for the horse. He caught her arm and pulled her up before she'd fully made the jump, and Smoke was already breaking into a run, which was remarkable, considering. The canyon floor was riverstone and loose gravel, and the walls were screaming with echoes, and a man up above was shouting, and another rifle cracked somewhere behind them. The exit of the pass came at them fast. She held the ledger against her chest with one arm and held on to Jessie with the other. And the canyon walls flashed past in a blur of red rock, and then they were through, out into open slope, running uphill through sparse grass and sage, and the shooting behind them dropped away in stages, as the canyon swallowed its own echoes. Jessie pushed Smoke hard for half a mile before pulling back. The horse came down to a canter, then a trot, sides heaving. Hannah looked back, no pursuit yet on the open slope. They'd moved fast to their horses, but they'd had theirs tied outside the canyon mouth, and that meant they'd been waiting, and waiting meant they hadn't expected this to go fast. That was a small advantage. It might be enough. She became aware of something then. A wetness against her forearm, where it rested against Jesse's left side. She moved her arm and looked. Dark. A long, wet stripe along his shirt from just below his left ribs, spreading slowly. "You're hit," she said. "Grazing shot." His voice was steady. "Ribs. It'll hold." "Jesse." "It'll hold, Hannah." He kept Smoke moving. "We need distance first. Then we look at it." She pressed her hand flat against the wound from behind, applying what pressure she could. He inhaled sharply at the contact, but didn't pull away. She could feel his muscles tight under her palm, the controlled breathing of someone managing pain with the same focused discipline he applied to everything else. She thought about the tracker in the brown coat. 5 positions, he'd said. She'd fired twice, and Jesse had fired. She tried to count and lost it in the blur. They'd broken out of a prepared ambush with one grazing wound between them. She thought about the ledger under her other arm. Still wrapped, still dry. It was worth it. The arithmetic on that was simple. They rode north through the afternoon, Jesse choosing terrain that made them hard to track, crossing 2 stream beds to break their trail. He didn't complain about the wound. He didn't mention it at all. She felt his breathing and knew from the rhythm that it was hurting more than he was letting on. 2 hours out from Red Canyon, he guided Smoke into a dry wash behind a stand of cottonwoods and pulled up. "Let me see," Hannah said. He dismounted without argument this time, which told her something about how much the ride had cost him. She got down and came around to his left side. He raised his arm without being asked, and she peeled the shirt away from the wound carefully. Grazing shot was accurate but generous. The bullet had cut a 4-inch furrow across his lower ribs, deep enough to bleed seriously, not deep enough to hit anything vital. She'd seen worse. She'd helped her mother treat worse, on ranch hands who'd come to the farm door after accidents too far from town. "Sit down," she said. "I'm Jesse. Sit down." He sat down against the cottonwood, with his forearms on his knees, and she tore strips from the cleanest section of her underskirt hem and got the wound cleaned and bound. He was absolutely still while she worked, watching the tree line with that permanent watchfulness of his, never quite entirely off duty. She tied off the last strip and sat back. "Evelyn Brooks," she said. "Do you know where her homestead is?" "About 12 miles northeast." "Why?" "Because we need shelter where we can be safe for more than a few hours." Evelyn knows how to keep quiet, and she has no love for Sterling Montgomery. Hannah stood. "And you need a real bed for at least one night, whether you're going to admit that or not." He looked up at her. There was something almost argumentative in his expression, and then he apparently thought better of it. 12 miles northeast, he said. "Can you ride?" He stood. A little slower than usual, she noticed. "I've ridden worse. That's not actually reassuring." He caught Smoke's reins and looked at her over the horse's neck. His expression was difficult to read, as it generally was, but there was something present in it that hadn't been there yesterday. Recognition, maybe, or the early stages of trust, which was rarer. "You shoot well," he said, for someone who hadn't picked up a rifle in 15 years. 14, she said. "And Coyote taught me that if you're going to shoot, shoot like you mean it." She walked around to the right side of Smoke, put her foot in the stirrup, and swung up into the saddle. Jesse raised an eyebrow. She looked down at him and waited. He mounted behind her this time, slowly, and she felt the small, sharp intake of breath when he settled his weight. She took the reins. He put his good right hand against her left side to steady himself. Hannah pointed Smoke northeast and started moving. Behind them, Red Canyon sat silent in the afternoon light, empty of everything except echoes, and the smell of burnt powder, and the absence of a ledger that Sterling Montgomery very badly wanted back. He was going to want it more tomorrow. Hannah intended to make sure of it. Evelyn Brooks answered the door with a shotgun. She was 61 years old, built like a fence post, with white hair pinned back severely and eyes that had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. She looked at Hannah first, then at Jesse behind her on the horse, then at the blood showing through the makeshift bandaging at his ribs, then back at Hannah. "Get him inside," she said, and stepped back from the door. The homestead was larger than it looked from the trail. The main house had 4 rooms, and behind it a long, low building that Evelyn used as a bunkhouse had been converted, sometime in recent months, into sleeping quarters for 6 women. Hannah counted them as Evelyn led her, and Jessie through the main room. Some were at the table eating. 1 was mending near the window. 2 were in the back, voices low. She recognized one of them. Mary Holt, Sterling's kitchen. Mary looked up from her bowl and went very still when she saw Hannah. Then her face did something complicated, and she stood up and came across the room and put her arms around Hannah without a word. Hannah held on for a moment. "You got out," she said. "3 weeks ago," Mary said, pulling back. Her eyes were wet. Evelyn sent a man with a wagon and a story about a sick relative. Sterling believed it or didn't care. I'm not sure which. She looked at the ledger under Hannah's arm. "Is that?" "Yes," Hannah said. Mary pressed her lips together. She nodded once, hard, like she was agreeing to something larger than the conversation. Evelyn had Jessie in a chair by the fireplace and was already unwinding Hannah's field bandaging, with the brisk authority of someone who'd done this before. Jessie sat with his hands on his knees and let her work. "Grazing shot," Evelyn said without inflection. "That's what I said," Jessie offered. "You're lucky. It grazed and not buried." She pressed a cloth to the wound, and Jessie's jaw tightened, though he made no sound. "How far did you ride on this?" "About 12 miles. Evelyn looked at him with an expression that conveyed significant professional disappointment. She turned to Hannah. "Get the small brown box off the top shelf in the back room. There's a bottle of carbolic in it, and a proper roll of linen bandage." Hannah found it and brought it back. Evelyn cleaned the wound properly, with carbolic that made Jesse's knuckles go white against his knees, and then bandaged it neatly, and taped the whole thing down with the decisive efficiency of someone with no patience for drama. "You'll sleep," Evelyn told him, "tonight and tomorrow morning at minimum. That's not negotiable." Jesse looked like he was going to argue, and then apparently looked at Evelyn's face and thought better of it. Hannah had the impression this was not a common outcome for Jesse Walker. He was put in the back room with the cot, and he was asleep before the sun went down. Hannah checked on him once, standing in the doorway for just a moment. His revolvers were on the floor within easy reach, because apparently some reflexes didn't rest even when the man did. His breathing was slow and even. The lines that were usually present around his eyes had released in sleep, and he looked younger. Not young, but younger. She went back to the main room. Evelyn had called the women to the table, 6 of them, plus Hannah seated around the wide pine surface with the oil lamp burning at the center. Hannah set the ledger down and opened it. She walked them through it, page by page. She explained the columns, the interest calculations, the fabricated initial debt figures, the entries Sterling had made in his own careful handwriting, documenting exactly which properties he intended to seize. Once each debt reached a specific threshold, she showed Mary the entry with her name on it. She showed 2 other women their own entries. The room was very quiet while she talked, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. One woman, younger than the rest, named Ruth, said, "I signed because I needed to feed my children." I couldn't read the whole document. His man said it was a standard labor agreement. It wasn't, Hannah said. "I know that now. There was nothing standard about it. It was written to trap." The language in the penalty clauses was buried on the 3rd page after 2 pages of ordinary-sounding terms. Most people stop reading carefully by page 3. Sterling knew that. He counted on it. Ruth looked at the page with her name on it for a long time. "Knowledge and black and white proof," Hannah said, "are the most powerful Equalizing weapons the vulnerable have against the corrupt. She let that sit for a moment. Then, Sterling's entire operation exists because these women couldn't access that proof. He kept it all in one place because he believed it was safe. He believed nobody he trapped would ever be able to read it, understand it, and act on it. That was his single greatest mistake. Evelyn, at the end of the table, looked at the ledger and then at Hannah. "What do you intend to do with it?" "Get it to a circuit judge." Judge Aaron Henderson is scheduled to reach Red Hollow territory within the month. He has a reputation for independence. Sterling's money hasn't reached him as far as I can determine. "As far as you can determine," Evelyn repeated. "Nothing is certain, but we go with what we have." Evelyn nodded slowly. She looked at the faces around the table. "The original ledger can't be the only copy," she said. She looked at Hannah. "You understand what I'm saying." "I was going to propose it tomorrow," Hannah said. "But yes, tonight, if people are willing." They were willing. Evelyn produced paper from a writing desk in the corner. More than Hannah expected, a full ream, slightly yellowed at the edges, but dry and good. She had 2 ink bottles and 4 pens, collected from a previous life, that she didn't discuss much. The women settled in with the lamps turned up as high as they'd go, and the work began. Hannah organized it like a production line. She read figures aloud, clearly and slowly, while 2 women who could write took dictation. Mary, who'd had some schooling as a girl, worked her own copy directly from the pages. Ruth, who couldn't write, held the lamp and turned pages on instruction, and periodically refilled the inkwells from the reserve bottle. They were 2 hours into it when the door to the back room opened. Jesse emerged looking marginally more human than he had going in. He'd slept in his clothes, and his hat was somewhere in the room behind him, which was the most undone she'd seen him. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. 7 women hunched over papers, the scratch of pens, the smell of lamp oil and ink, the ledger open at the center of the table. He crossed the room and looked over Hannah's shoulder at the copy she was producing. She kept working. "How are your ribs functional?" he said. "That's also not reassuring." He pulled a chair from the wall and sat down across the corner from her. He watched her pen move for a moment. Then he looked at the ledger page she was working from and back at her copy. His eyes moved across the columns of figures with a focus that suggested he was actually reading them. "Sit closer," Hannah said. "If you're going to read it, you might as well help copy it." He looked at her. "There's a pen," she said, and pushed one across the table. He looked at the pen. He looked at it the way a man might look at a tool he recognized from description, but had never personally operated. She watched him pick it up. He held it the way most people hold a pen if they learned writing late, or rarely, gripping it too far down toward the nib, pressing too hard. He dipped it in the ink, pressed it to a fresh sheet, and produced a series of marks that were technically letters, but had clearly been achieved through determination, rather than habit. The ink blotched on the second word. He lifted the pen and looked at it with flat suspicion. "Less pressure," Hannah said. She leaned over and adjusted his grip slightly, moving his fingers up the shaft. "The nib does the work. You just guide it." He tried again. Better. Still rough, but legible. They worked side by side in the lamplight, his shoulder close to hers. The fire in the hearth burned down to coals, and nobody fed it, because nobody wanted to stop moving long enough to cross the room. Ruth fell asleep in her chair, and Evelyn draped a blanket over her without waking her. Jesse filled half a page, slow and deliberate, before he paused and read back what he'd written. He found an error, frowned at it, and went back to correct the figure. "You're particular," Hannah said. "If it's worth doing, it's worth doing right," he said. "That's a fine principle for a man who spent 10 years outside the law." He didn't answer immediately. He finished the correction first. Then, "The law and what's right aren't always the same thing. Took me a while to understand that I didn't have to pretend otherwise." Hannah looked at him. "And now?" "Now I try to pick fights where the two overlap." He dipped his pen again. "This qualifies." She went back to her own work, The pen scratched against the paper. Outside, somewhere deep in the pines, an owl hunted in silence. The women around the table worked in companionable quiet, the kind that forms naturally when people are doing something that matters. Hannah's back ached. Her wrist had started protesting an hour ago. She wrote through it. Around midnight, she became aware that Jessie had stopped writing and was watching her. Not staring, just watching, with that particular quality of attention that he brought to everything. Like he was reading her, the same way he'd read the canyon walls that morning, looking for things worth knowing. She kept her eyes on the page. "What? You're going to be all right," he said. It came out simply, like a statement of observed fact rather than reassurance. Like he'd run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion. She finished the column she was working on before she answered. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He went back to his page. "I said it anyway." She didn't respond to that, but she noticed it. She filed it away in the category of things that mattered more than they appeared to. By 2 in the morning, they had 3 complete copies of the ledger, cross-checked against the original. Hannah wrapped the original back in its oilskin and passed 1 copy to Evelyn for safekeeping. The second she planned to deliver separately. The third she and Jessie would carry. The women drifted to their beds. Evelyn banked the fire and extinguished all but 1 lamp and retired without ceremony. Hannah and Jessie were the last 2 at the table. She stacked the original ledger and its documentation, tying the oilskin tight. Jessie cleaned the pens and capped the ink, moving carefully around his bandaged ribs. "Tobias," Jessie said. She looked up Sterling's accountant. "Tobias Marsh. He's been skimming information for the past year, small pieces, things Sterling wouldn't miss. I have a contact who put me in touch with him 2 months ago. He has bank records, transfers, account numbers, payments to county officials." He set the last pen down. "Sterling's ledger shows the fraud. Tobias's records show who he paid to protect it. You need both to close every door." Hannah turned this over. "How sure are you of Tobias?" "Fairly sure. He has a daughter, 17. Sterling knows she exists, and has mentioned her in passing in ways that amount to a standing threat." Jesse's expression didn't change much, but his voice went flat. "Tobias wants out. He wants the whole operation burned down. He just doesn't want to be the one holding the match when Sterling looks for someone to blame." "So we give him cover," Hannah said. "We meet him. We exchange copies. He gives us the bank records. We give him enough of the ledger copies that the information is already too far gone to stop, and he's no longer the critical link." Hannah thought about it. "Where?" "There's an abandoned quarry 12 miles south of Red Hollow," he proposed it. "Off the main roads, nobody has business there." "When?" 3 days. He set the date a week ago, before any of this happened. Jessie looked at her. "Things have moved faster than either of us planned. But the meeting still holds." She nodded slowly. 3 days. That was enough time for Jessie's ribs to stabilize, for her to rest, for Evelyn to find a trusted courier to dispatch one of the ledger copies toward Judge Henderson ahead of their movements. 3 days was tight, but it was workable. "Get some sleep," Jessie said. He stood carefully. "You've been awake for close to 20 hours. So have you. I slept 2 hours before you conscripted me into accounting work." She almost smiled. "You volunteered." "I sat down," he said. "That's not the same as volunteering." She gathered the oilskin package and stood. She looked at him across the table, in the low lamplight ink on his right hand, color better than it had been when he'd come off that horse, something present in his eyes that she was still learning to read. "Jessie?" she said. He waited. "Thank you." She held his gaze, not just for the canyon, for tonight. She stopped, because language was turning out to be an insufficient tool for the actual thing she meant, which was something larger and more complicated than a single event. He seemed to understand that. He nodded once. "Sleep well, Hannah." She took her package and went to find a bed. Jesse sat back down in his chair, faced the door, and picked up his revolvers. Some habits were just too old to argue with. The 3 days moved quickly. Jesse's ribs were bad the first morning, better the second, and by the third day, he was moving, without the careful deliberateness that had told Hannah more about the wound's severity than anything he'd said about it. He worked with the horses while he healed, and did not sit still well, and once spent 45 minutes cleaning both revolvers in minute detail which she suspected was less about the guns and more about having something to do with his hands. She spent the time organizing. She and Evelyn identified a courier, a taciturn trapper named Cal, who ran supply routes north and had no particular feelings about Sterling Montgomery either way, which was as much neutrality as the territory offered. Cal took one sealed copy of the ledger, with a letter addressed to Circuit Judge Aaron Henderson's office, and left before dawn on the second day. Hannah watched him ride out and felt a small, deliberate loosening in her chest. One copy was already moving. Whatever happened next, that copy existed. The women at Evelyn's table became a project in their own right. Hannah spent evenings with them, going through the copies of the ledger, explaining what each entry meant in practical terms. She showed Ruth how to identify the compounding interest clauses in the language. She worked with Mary on understanding what made a contract legally enforceable versus what made it fraudulent. They weren't lawyers. Neither was Hannah, but understanding the principle was its own form of armor. If you sign something and you don't understand it, Hannah told them one evening, the answer is not to feel ashamed of not understanding. The answer is to stop. Ask questions. Get someone to read it alongside you. Walk away if you need time to think. No legitimate agreement requires you to sign before you're ready. That urgency, that pressure they create, that sense that you must sign right now or lose the opportunity, that urgency is almost always the fraud itself. Ruth had her chin in her hand, listening carefully. Sterling's man told my husband it was a limited offer. First come, first served. Yes, Hannah said. They always do. Jessie appeared in the doorway during this particular exchange. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He had that quality, indoors and out, of arriving without announcement. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, and she understood it to mean that he thought she was doing something worth doing. She turned back to her students and kept going. On the third day, they packed and said goodbye to Evelyn in the gray pre-dawn. Evelyn stood on her porch with her shotgun in the crook of her arm and watched them prepare to leave. She kissed Hannah once on the forehead and looked at Jessie over Hannah's shoulder. You come back this way, she said. Plan 2, Jessie said. That's not what I mean. She looked at him steadily. Both of you come back. Jessie held her gaze. Yes, ma'am. They rode south. The quarry was a 2-hour ride on quiet trails. Jessie knew the route without apparent need for navigation, which suggested he'd scouted it at some earlier point. He had that habit, she was learning, of quietly solving problems before they became problems, doing the invisible work that made things look easier than they were. The morning was overcast, the cloud cover low and thick, turning the light flat and gray. A cold front had moved through overnight, dropping the temperature enough that their breath came visible. The horses moved at a steady walk, ears forward, relaxed. Hannah rode her own mount. Today, a steady roan mare Evelyn had pressed on her, saying she had too many horses and the mare needed work. Hannah suspected this was not true and accepted the gift without pressing the point. She rode alongside Jessie rather than behind him. She noticed that he noticed this. Something in his bearing eased slightly, the way it did when a thing turned out the way he'd hoped, without having to say so. Tell me about Tobias, she said. He's been with Sterling 12 years. Came in as a clerk, worked up to head of accounts. He knows everything about the financial operation, because he built most of it. Jessie kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He's not a cruel man. That's my read on him. He made choices for money and convenience, and told himself it wasn't his fault what Sterling did with the contracts. Then his daughter got old enough that Sterling started looking at her and making those comments, and Tobias ran his own moral accounting and didn't like the total. How do we handle the exchange? Simple. We show him the ledger copy. Confirm we have the information to move forward with or without his records. He provides the bank documents. We give him a sealed copy addressed to Judge Henderson, already written evidence, already dispatched. Nothing he can do to stop it, which means nothing Sterling can threaten him with that would change the outcome. Jesse glanced at her. Tobias becomes more valuable as a cooperative witness than as a liability. We make sure he understands that. And Anna, his daughter? He'll want assurance she's protected. Evelyn? Hannah said. That's what I was thinking. The quarry came into view around mid-morning. It was a wide, flat depression in the earth, rimmed on three sides by low limestone walls, scarred from years of blasting. Equipment had been left in place when the operation folded rusted drilling frames, a collapsed ore cart, the skeletal remains of a wooden processing shed. A fire pit at the quarry's center held old ash. Tobias was already there. He was a small man, unremarkable to look at, with round spectacles and the posture of someone who spent most of his life at a desk. He wore a dark coat and held his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim. His horse was tied to the ore cart frame. He looked up when they rode in, and the relief on his face at seeing Hannah was complicated. There was guilt in it. "Miss Miller," he said, "I want to say." "Later," Hannah said. She scanned the quarry walls out of habit, the way Jesse had taught her without meaning to teach her. "Nothing visible. You have the records?" Tobias reached into his coat and produced a leather folio, thick with papers. He held it out. Jesse dismounted and took it. He opened it and moved through the contents, fast but thorough. His eyes went down columns of figures, across account numbers, through pages of transfer records. His expression didn't change, but his focus sharpened in a way she could read by now. "This is everything," Jesse said. "Every payment." Said, "County sheriff, 2 deputy positions, the municipal recorder who altered property deeds. Judge Carver in the lower circuit. He's the one Sterling usually routes cases through. All of it. Dates, amounts, account numbers." Jesse looked at Hannah. She gave a small nod. "All right," Jesse said. He took the copy they'd prepared from his saddlebag and extended it to Tobias. "This is the copy of the ledger addressed to Judge Henderson. One copy is already in transit to his office. Others are held securely at locations Sterling doesn't know about. The information is past the point of containment. Your cooperation is noted in the accompanying letter." Tobias took the package with shaking hands. "Your daughter," Hannah said. "Does she know you're here?" "No. There's a homestead 12 miles north. A woman named Evelyn Brooks. If you can get Anna there in the next 48 hours, she'll be safe until this is finished." She met his eyes. "I give you my word." Tobias pressed the package against his chest. His jaw was working. "I should have done this years ago," he said. "Yes," Hannah said. Not harshly, just honestly. "But you're doing it now." He nodded. He put his hat on, untied his horse, and mounted. He looked down at them once. "Sterling knows you came to the canyon," he said. "He knows you have the original. He's been in a rage since the ranch yard." He hesitated. "Be careful." He rode out. Hannah watched him go. Jesse was already packing the bank documents into the oilskin with the ledger copy, methodical and fast. The sound came a half-second before she consciously identified it. She knew it, the particular snap of a dry branch under a boot, too deliberate to be an animal, from the southern rim of the quarry. Then a second sound, from the east, not echoes. 2 separate positions. Jesse was already moving. He dropped flat behind the ore cart frame, pulling Hannah down with him by the arm, and the first rifle shot hit the ground where they'd been standing and sent a spray of quarry dust into the air. It was not 3 positions this time. It was more. She could hear them calling positions to each other from the rim. Professional. Rehearsed. Not Sterling's regular enforcers, these were something else. Something Sterling had saved for a moment when he was serious. Jesse returned fire from behind the ore cart. Hannah grabbed the Winchester from its scabbard on the roan, who had shied hard but hadn't bolted, and came up beside him. They worked the same way they had in Red Canyon, covering different angles, moving between shots, not staying in any one position long enough to be bracketed. But Red Canyon had been a canyon. The quarry was open. The shot came from an angle she hadn't covered. She heard it before she felt Jesse go down. The sound of it was wrong, too solid, too heavy for a near miss. She turned and saw him against the ore cart, with his hand pressed to his chest, the left side and the bright red spreading through his fingers. Jesse, the copy, he said. He was still, absolutely focused, still tracking the quarry rim with his eyes even as he pressed his hand to the wound. He grabbed her arm. Get the copy. Run. I'm not Hannah. His grip was fierce. The judge. Get it to the judge. She grabbed the oilskin package from where he'd dropped it. She turned to get back to him. Two of Sterling's men were already coming over the quarry rim at a run, and she put a shot in the dirt, 5 feet in front of the first one, which bought her 3 seconds. 3 seconds was not enough. A third man came from behind her. He caught her arm and wrenched the Winchester away. A fourth had Jesse at gunpoint, which was the only reason she stopped moving. Sterling Montgomery walked over the south rim of the quarry. He was impeccable, as always. Fresh shirt, riding boots without a speck of mud despite the terrain. He looked at Jesse against the ore cart, and then at Hannah with a smile that had no warmth in it at all. He walked to her and took the oilskin package from her hand. He opened it, confirmed the contents, and walked to the fire pit. He dropped the package in. One of his men touched a match to the fire. The dry tinder caught immediately, and the ledger copy and accompanying pages began to burn with a steady orange flame. Hannah watched the pages curl and blacken and disappear. Sterling turned back to her. He drew a Bowie knife from his belt, not quickly or aggressively, just produced it and held it loosely, and tilted her chin up with the flat of the blade. Now, who's going to fire a shot to save you, sweetheart? He said. She looked past him, just for a moment, at Jesse. He was looking back at her. He'd gone very pale. His hand was still pressed to his chest, and the blood was moving too fast through his fingers, and she had the terrible thought that she was looking at a man measuring out his remaining seconds. She held his gaze. She didn't look away from him even when Sterling's men pulled her arms back and put the irons on. Get them separated, Sterling said. He was already walking back toward the south rim, the burned evidence at his back, the knife going back into its sheath. Take her north. I'll deal with the outlaw. 2 men grabbed Jesse under his arms and began dragging him toward the quarry's eastern edge, where the limestone dropped away to the river below. Hannah was being pulled in the opposite direction. She twisted against the hands, holding her, fought for one more second of eye contact. Jesse looked at her across the quarry. His revolvers were gone. His hand was at his chest. He was still upright, only because 2 men were holding him up. He looked at her with complete clarity in his gray eyes, and what she read in them was not fear. It was something closer to resolve. Then they pulled him over the edge. She heard the splash from 40 feet away. The river below the quarry was icy runoff from the northern elevations, deep and fast and cold enough to stop a man's heart in minutes. She knew this. She knew it in the immediate, terrible way you know things that cannot be taken back. Sterling's men were marching her away. The fire in the pit was still burning, the last pages of the copy turning to ash, and the quarry behind her was empty of everything except the river's distant sound and the echo of one very large mistake. Sterling had the chains on her wrists and ash where her evidence had been, and the certainty of a man who had just watched his last real obstacle sink into a frozen river. Now, he said, from somewhere ahead of her, his voice pleasant and final, let's talk about where you've hidden the rest. Hannah walked forward in the chains with her jaw set and her mind already moving. Jesse Walker had not taught her to panic. He'd taught her to react to what she saw. She kept walking. She kept thinking. The irons were cold against her raw wrists, and somewhere behind her, in the dark water of the eastern river, the only person who'd fired a shot for her was either fighting the current or losing it, and she was the only one in a position to do something about either outcome. She had to get free first, then she'd go back for him. That was the order of things. and she was going to hold to it if it killed her. The men holding Hannah's arms were not paying close attention to her face. That was their mistake. She'd learned something in 5 years on Sterling's property. Not from Sterling himself, and not from any of his hired hands, but from the land itself, from the Wyoming Territory's flat indifference to human suffering. The land didn't care if you were in pain. The land didn't care if you were afraid. The land only cared whether you moved or stayed still, whether you acted or waited for someone else to act. Hannah acted. She went limp, not dramatically, not with a gasp or a performance. She just let every muscle in her legs go slack at the same time. Dropped her full weight straight down, and the two men holding her arms were suddenly holding dead weight at an angle they hadn't prepared for. The one on her left stumbled forward. The one on her right swore and adjusted his grip, which meant both his hands were occupied, which meant neither hand was anywhere near her waist, where the glass was. She'd taken it from Evelyn's kitchen 2 days ago, without knowing exactly why. A curved sliver from a broken jar lid, wrapped twice in cloth on one end, so she could hold it without slicing her own palm. She'd tucked it into the seam of her dress at the hip, just under the outer layer. She got her right hand to it, while the men were still reorganizing their grip. She stood back up before they'd even realized she'd gone down. Cooperating again. Obedient. Her right hand stayed at her hip, with the glass shard pressed between her palm and her dress, held there by pressure alone. They walked her another half-mile through scrub pine and loose rock toward a cluster of Sterling's men near a line of horses. The sky had gone fully overcast now. The temperature was dropping fast. Hannah counted 6 men visible. 2 more she could hear but not see, back near the quarry rim. Sterling was not among them. He'd gone somewhere else, or was coming separately, or trusted his men to deliver one chained woman without his personal supervision. That was also a mistake. The man on her left dropped back for a moment to light a cigarette. The one on her right was watching the terrain ahead. She worked the glass shard free and started on the rope between her wrists. She couldn't see what she was doing. She did it by feel, by the angle of her wrists, by the tiny movements she could make without either man noticing the shift in her shoulders. The glass was sharp, and the rope was braided hemp, and it was not fast work. She felt the glass nick her thumb once and kept going. The rope parted on the inside strand first, then the second. She held her wrists together and kept walking, and let the rope stay in place by its own tension. One more strand. She could feel it. It gave when they reached the horses. She moved before the man on her right reached for the saddle horn. She went left, through a gap between 2 horses that no person should have been able to fit through quickly. And she was running before either man had turned around. Not toward the quarry, not back the way they'd come. She went into the trees at a diagonal, headed for the sound she'd been tracking for the last half-mile water. The river was lower here than at the quarry. The eastern branch ran shallow over a gravel bed before the gorge deepened further south. She hit the bank and went right, upstream, moving as fast as the rocky ground allowed. Behind her, she could hear shouting, the sound of men deciding between pursuit and the horses. And the horses won, because horses always won that particular argument, which meant she had maybe 2 minutes before they'd cut around the tree line and find the bank. She ran upstream. She found him 40 yards above the first bend. He was snagged on a tangle of submerged roots where the bank jutted out, face barely above the waterline. One arm locked over a thick root above the surface and the rest of him in the current. The current here was slower than at the gorge. Deeper banks channeled the main force further out, but the water was still running snowmelt cold, and he'd been in it long enough that his skin had gone the color of old clay. Jessie. She was in the water to her knees before she'd finished the word. The cold was shocking, a full-body impact, and she understood immediately why he hadn't been able to pull himself out. You lost grip strength fast in water this cold. You lost everything fast. She grabbed his arm and pulled. He was heavy, and the current had him, and the root was holding him in place. which was the only reason she had anything to work with. She got both hands under his right arm and dug her heels into the gravel bottom and pulled again. He moved, slowly. Then all at once, the current releasing him as she pulled him past the roots angle, and they both went down into the shallows together, Hannah getting a mouthful of river water, and then she was on her feet again, with his arm over her shoulders and her arm around his waist, and they were moving toward the bank. She got him out of the water. She didn't know how. Later, she would not be able to reconstruct the exact sequence of it, the precise physics of one woman getting a man that size up a 4-foot bank with the river at her knees and men's voices somewhere in the tree line to the south. She did it. That was what she knew. She half dragged, half walked him along the bank, moving north, looking for the things she'd spotted from the trail 2 days ago when she and Jesse had ridden in. A limestone face running close to the river. She'd noticed it then without thinking about why she was noticing it. The cave entrance was low, maybe 3 feet high, set into the rock face just above the high water line. She'd have missed it at any other season. She didn't miss it now. She got him inside. It opened up once you were through the entrance, high enough to stand. In the middle, 20 feet deep, dry. The river's sound came through the rock in a low, constant hum. No wind. The temperature was cold, but not brutal, significantly warmer than the water. She laid Jesse on the cave floor and knelt beside him. His breathing was there, shallow and rapid, but there. The bullet wound was still bleeding, slower than at the quarry, but consistent, and the cold had complicated everything. His lips had gone blue at the edges, and when she pressed her fingers to his neck, his pulse was present, but too fast and too light. She needed heat. Everything else came after heat. She went back to the cave entrance and looked out. No voices close by. She could hear the river. She could hear wind in the treetops 50 yards out. Nothing else immediate. She gathered wood fast, staying low, staying in the shadow of the limestone. Dry branches from the base of a dead pine just up the bank. Bark strips. A broken section of fallen log, dry enough to burn. She had her matches in the same seam pocket as the glass had come from. She'd put them there 3 days ago, when traveling with Jesse, had taught her to carry everything that mattered on her person. She got the fire going inside the cave. The smoke rose and dispersed through a natural crack in the ceiling that drew air from somewhere above. Not perfect ventilation. Good enough. She got his coat off, then his shirt. She worked quickly, not allowing herself to stop and think about the wound or the color of him, just moving through what had to happen in the right sequence. The bullet had gone in under his left collarbone and angled down, lodged somewhere below the shoulder. The entry hole was small. That was both good and bad. She heated the blade of his own boot knife in the coals. She tore strips from her dress hem because she'd run out of anything better. She pressed a folded cloth to the wound site and looked at the cave ceiling for 2 seconds, and then looked back down at him and did what she had to do. He was unconscious through most of it. That was a mercy. She cleaned the wound with the last of the water she'd been carrying in her canteen. She packed it and bound it tight, the best she could do, without carbolic or proper linen. She covered him with his coat and her own, and then sat beside him and put more wood on the fire and waited. Outside, she could hear the search, voices carrying across the water at intervals. Once, boots on gravel less than 100 yards away, moving north, then fading. She sat completely still with her hand on Jesse's wrist and did not breathe loudly. They passed. He came back to himself sometime in the middle of the first night. She knew it before he spoke, because his breathing changed slower, less labored, more deliberate, like a man surfacing. "Hannah, here," she said. He turned his head toward her. His eyes were clearer than she'd expected. "The copy. Gone," she said. "He burned it." He took that in. She watched him absorb it and file it and move on without the luxury of dwelling on it, which she understood because she'd been doing the same thing for hours. "Tobias's records," he said. "Still here." She patted the oilskin folded inside her dress against her ribs. She'd kept the bank documents. She hadn't had the ledger copy in her hands when they'd caught her. Jessie had. What Sterling had burned was the copy, not the bank documents Tobias had provided. Something shifted in Jessie's face. Not quite relief. More like the recalculation of a man who thought his hand was empty and just found one card still in it. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough. You need to stay still." "How long was I in the water?" "Long enough." She put more wood on the fire. "I pulled the bullet out. The wound is bound. You have a fever starting, which I expect you'll try to argue with." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember going over the edge. You were already past knowing much by then." She looked at him steadily. "I watched them throw you over." He held her gaze. She could see him understanding what it had cost her to watch that and keep walking, to not fight harder in that moment, to trust the sequence of things. "You did right," he said. "I know I did." She looked at the fire. "I still watched it happen." He reached out and his hand found her wrist. Not grabbing, not gripping. Just there. She looked at his hand on her wrist, and then she looked at the fire for a long time, and the cave hummed with river sound and wood smoke, and the weight of all the things two people carry when they've been through a day like this one. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I spent 5 years doing what I was told. Not because I agreed with it, because I was trying to survive long enough to do something about it. And somewhere in those 5 years, I started believing that surviving was all there was, that I'd already used up whatever portion of good things the world was going to give me." She paused. "You fired one shot from a ridge on a Tuesday in August for a woman you'd never met. You didn't ask whether she'd earned it. You didn't calculate whether she was worth it." "I heard you ask," he said. "That was enough." "I know." She turned and looked at him. I'm saying that changed something for me, the way you did it, like there was never any other option." She kept her voice even. Because she was not a woman who did things melodramatically, but she also was not in the habit of leaving important things unsaid. "You don't have to carry what happened to your sister alone anymore. You're not that man anymore. I think you know that. But I think you need someone to say it out loud." Jessie looked at the cave ceiling. For a long moment he didn't answer, and she'd learned by now that his silences weren't avoidance. They were processing. He meant what he said, and so he took time before he said it. "I've been telling myself it was about the system," he said finally. "About the prices and the Montgomerys. Bigger than one person, and that's true. But Clara was specific. She was my sister, and she was 22, and she liked bad coffee, and she could name every constellation, and she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them." He stopped. "I couldn't save her, and I've been trying to even that account ever since." "It doesn't work that way," Hannah said. "You can't balance that ledger." "No, you can do something real in her name. You've already started." She met his eyes. "But you can also just live. At some point, those two things have to be allowed to coexist." He looked at her for a long time. She held the look because she meant what she'd said, and she wasn't going to glance away from it. "You're something else, Hannah Miller," he said. "I'm a practical woman with an ink-stained thumb and a glass shard in my dress," she said. He almost smiled. Given the circumstances, she counted it as a full one. She kept the fire going through the night and into the next day. He ran a fever that first night, high enough to worry her, and she kept him covered and kept talking to him when he surfaced. Ordinary things, the sound of a voice being its own kind of anchor. She talked about her father's farm. She talked about the first contract she'd ever understood, the satisfaction of it, seeing the language resolve into meaning the way a blurry thing sharpens when you get the right angle on it. He listened, even half-conscious in the way he had. The fever broke on the second morning. She knew it when she pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the change. She sat back and closed her eyes for the count of 5. When she opened them, he was watching her with clear eyes. "You've been awake all night again," he said. "I have a history of that." He pushed himself upright against the cave wall. Slowly, she watched him test his range of motion, cataloging what hurt and she watched him be honest about it rather than pushing past it, which she took as a good sign. "We need to move," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "You can argue with me," she said, "or you can eat something and sleep 4 more hours and be actually useful when we ride out." He considered this. "What's to eat?" She produced hardtack from her coat pocket. He took it without comment. She watched him eat and looked at the cave wall and thought about what came next. They had Tobias's bank records. They had the original ledger, still with Cal on the road to Judge Henderson. What they didn't have was a copy to work from, and Sterling believed they had nothing at all. That belief was going to cost him something. She just had to figure out exactly how to spend it. Outside the cave, the river ran on in the cold Wyoming dark, indifferent as always, carrying the melt from 100 miles of high country down to wherever water went when no one was watching. Hannah added the last piece of wood to the fire and let Jesse sleep. She was already planning. Red Hollow looked different from the south approach. Hannah had only ever come into town from the east, along the main territorial road, which was the way people came when they had nothing to hide. Coming from the south meant crossing 2 miles of broken scrub and a dry creek bed and a ridge that overlooked the town's back quarter from a distance that made the buildings look like toys somebody hadn't finished painting. Jesse pulled smoke up at the ridge line, and they sat together looking down at the settlement. 3 days since the quarry. His color was back. The wound still hurt. She could tell from how he mounted and how he shifted his weight, and the occasional controlled exhale when the horse moved wrong under him. But he was riding straight and watching sharp, and had stopped accepting her assessment of what he could handle, which she took as the clearest sign of recovery. "Sterling's put men in the street," Jessie said. She could see them. 2 near the livery, one at the north end of the main road, another on the porch of the dry goods. Not subtle, not meant to be. Sterling was sending a message to the town. This was still his territory. "How do we go in?" she said. "We don't, not yet." He kept his eyes on the street below. "We wait until dark and come in through the alley behind the barber shop. I know a place." She wanted to ask about the place, and then decided she'd find out when they got there. With Jesse, asking in advance often produced less information than simply being present for the answer. They waited on the ridge until the sun went fully down. The temperature dropped fast once the light was gone, and they sat with the horses in a stand of juniper that blocked the wind from the north and ate the last of the food they'd been carrying, which was not much, but was hot, because Hannah had insisted on stopping to make coffee and hardtack that morning, and Jesse had not argued. He was doing that more not arguing, not capitulating, nothing as passive as that, more like factoring her judgment into his own arithmetic and arriving at the same answer by a slightly adjusted route, she noticed. She didn't say anything about it. They rode into Red Hollow after midnight. The back of the barber shop shared an alley with a tack room that had a separate entrance from the main street, and inside the tack room, under a false floor beneath a specific section of loose boarding, Jesse produced a flat tin box that had been there for 8 months. Inside the tin, $40 in paper currency, a folded map, 2 boxes of ammunition, and a sealed envelope. Hannah looked at the envelope. Jesse picked it up and held it out to her. The envelope was addressed to Circuit Judge Aaron Henderson in Jesse's handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter explaining the nature of Sterling Montgomery's operation, summarizing the ledger's contents from memory, and listing the key entry points for verification. It was not as good as the actual ledger. It was considerably better than nothing. She looked up at him. "I wrote it when I first arrived in the territory," he said. "Before I knew about you. Before I knew the ledger existed. I was documenting what I could piece together from outside." "You have a backup," she said. "I have a backup." He paused. "It's not evidence the way the ledger is evidence, but it establishes a documented account from a named individual, dates and details. And if Henderson is the man I believe he is, it's enough to open an inquiry." Hannah sat down on the tack room floor with the letter in her hands and read it through twice. He'd been thorough. He'd named properties, named women. He'd traced through other towns who'd described the same pattern, estimated the financial scale based on land records he'd cross-referenced from county offices in 2 different territories. It was the work of 8 months, assembled piece by piece, and it was careful and specific, and it was real. She looked at him. "You quiet, solitary man," she said. He sat down across from her. He looked at the letter and then at the tin box. "I didn't have a way to get it to Henderson directly. He doesn't stay in one place long enough to get ahead of, and I couldn't walk into a judge's office looking like I look." "What do you look like?" He gave her a flat look. "Wanted poster material," she said. 8 counties, he confirmed. "And yet, here you are, writing letters to circuit judges." The letter was going to need someone to deliver it credibly, someone who could speak to the women directly, who had personal experience with the contracts, who could testify in their own right. He looked at her. "I didn't know who that was going to be. But I knew someone would come. The situation required it, and then I came, and then you came." He looked at the fire. "I'd been watching the Montgomery property for a month. I saw them bring you in. I was already positioned on that ridge because I'd been looking for an opportunity, and that yard full of people looked like one." He paused. "I heard you. I heard what you said. Please help me," she said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. "I've heard women ask for help before and done nothing. In the early years, when I was moving fast through places and telling myself it wasn't my problem. After Clara, I couldn't anymore. But that morning, the way you said it just plainly, no expectation, just putting it out into the air and letting whoever was listening decide." He stopped. "I was going to fire a warning shot, move the situation without committing to it. Instead, I took out the iron." She looked at him. "I'm glad you did." "So am I," he said. Which was the most direct admission she'd gotten from him about anything that wasn't tactical, and she understood it to mean something considerably larger than the words. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside the oilskin with Tobias's bank records. 2 things now, 2 real things. Plus whatever Cal had already delivered to Henderson, which was the original ledger and her covering letter. "Tell me about Sterling," she said. Jesse leaned back against the tackroom wall. "He believes he's won. He has the copy he burned, which means he thinks we're out of evidence. He has you listed as captured, which he knows is wrong, because his men lost you, but he'll assume you ran. He'll assume I'm dead." He looked at the ceiling. "He'll move fast. When men like Sterling think they've cleared the board, they start claiming their winnings. The land seizures. He'll start filing immediately. Properties with payments in arrears, which is every property because the arrears are manufactured. He'll use his man in the municipal recorder's office to push them through fast, before anyone can contest." Hannah thought about the women at Evelyn's table. Ruth and her children. The farmers along the eastern creek whose names she'd read in the ledger. The people who would wake up in a week and find someone presenting them with a legal notice they couldn't read, filed with a recorder who'd been paid to process it without question. She thought about the judge. "Henderson's stagecoach," she said. "He's due in Red Hollow territory in 4 days," Jesse said. "Sterling knows that." "Yes. If Henderson arrives with the ledger and my letter and your documentation and Tobias's bank records, the whole thing unravels publicly and fast. Sterling's paid judge is the lower circuit, not Henderson. Henderson's independent. Sterling can't buy a verdict there." "No," Jesse agreed, "which means he can't let Henderson get to Red Hollow." She'd been building toward it and landed on it at the same moment. She sat with it, for a second, the full shape of it. "He's going to go after the stagecoach," she said. Jesse nodded, not with satisfaction, with the grave, focused acknowledgement of a man who has just confirmed the location of the next fire. "The route comes in from the north," Jesse said. "Single road through the Redstone Narrows, about 8 miles out. If you want to stop a stagecoach short of town, that's where you do it. Rocky terrain, limited visibility, and it's outside Red Hollow's immediate jurisdiction. Sterling's men can operate there without witnesses. When does Sterling know Henderson's schedule? The schedule's public record. Stageline posts it. He looked at her. He already knows. He's had 4 days to plan. 4 days. Which meant the ambush was set, and the men were placed, and the only open question was whether anyone was going to ride out to that stagecoach before it reached the Narrows. "We have to warn Henderson," Hannah said. "Or intercept him first. Or both," Jesse said. "Your ribs are not the primary concern right now." "Jesse?" "Hassa." He looked at her directly, not dismissively, just with the calm, clear eyes of a man who'd assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion. "I know what this costs. I also know what it costs to let that stagecoach reach the Narrows without us." He paused. "I can ride. I can shoot. That's enough." She looked at him for a long moment. He was right. She knew he was right. That didn't make it easier. "Tomorrow night," she said. "We ride out at dusk, get ahead of the stage. We need to find Henderson before he hits the Narrows." "Agreed." She leaned back against the opposite wall. The tack room smelled of leather and oil, and the cold, particular smell of stored metal. The single oil lamp they'd lit threw long shadows up the wall. She thought about the women in Evelyn's house. She thought about what she'd told them, about contracts, about the urgency that was always the fraud itself. "You must sign now. You must decide now. The pressure is a tactic." She thought about how the truth moved. Slowly, carefully, in oil-wrapped packages dispatched by taciturn trappers named Cal, in sealed tin boxes under false floors, in copied pages produced by lamplight, by women who'd been told their whole lives that the documents didn't concern them. Sterling had spent 12 years building a system that depended on people not knowing, on them not reading, on them not understanding that a contract was only enforceable when it was honest, that debt was only real when it was real, that was supposed to protect them too. She'd spent 5 years in his kitchen and his fields, and she'd used those years to learn every word of his own language, and then read his own records back to him. She said it out loud, not to Jesse particularly, more to the room. Knowledge and black and white proof are the most powerful equalizing weapons the vulnerable have against the corrupt. Jesse looked at her. "I keep coming back to it," she said. "Every step of this. Every time I think about what we're actually fighting. It's not just Sterling. It's the system he built on ignorance, on keeping people from understanding what had been done to them." She looked at the oilskin. The minute a person can read that contract clearly, the minute they understand what those words actually mean, Sterling loses his entire mechanism. He has nothing left. "That's why he's so afraid of that ledger," Jesse said. "That's why he burned it in front of me. He wanted me to see it go. He wanted that to be the thing I remembered." She shook her head. "He doesn't understand that it doesn't matter if the book burns. The knowledge is already out." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "Then the women at Evelyn's. What you taught them." Ruth can now identify a compounding interest clause in a labor contract. Mary understands what makes a debt legally contestable. 2 of the others can read well enough to work through a basic agreement if given time. She met his eyes. Sterling can't put that back. He can't make them not know what they know. That's already done. Jesse looked at the oilskin with Tobias's records. He looked at the letter in his own handwriting. He looked at her. "When this is over," he said. She waited. "What you were doing with those women, the teaching, the explaining." He turned his cup in his hands. "That's the part that lasts. The legal case, Henderson, the trial that's justice for this situation. But the other thing, the teaching, that prevents the next one." She had thought about this too. She'd been thinking about it since the first night at Evelyn's table, when she'd watched Ruth's face change as the language of the contract became clear to her. That specific shift, the moment a person understands that the thing they thought was permanent and immovable is actually just words, and words can be learned, and what can be learned can be contested, and what can be contested can be changed. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about what that looks like after." He nodded and didn't push further, but she understood that he was thinking about after two. That it was a word they were both carefully using now. A future that had shape. She picked up the oilskin and tucked it inside her coat. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he agreed. Then we'd better sleep. She looked at him. And this time you're actually going to sleep. You're not going to sit in a chair facing the door with your guns out. He looked at her with an expression that was approximately 70% argument. Jessie, the door still needs. I'll sit with the door, she said. He closed his mouth. She reached across and took his revolvers from his belt, which was either the most presumptuous thing she'd ever done or the most natural, and set them on the floor beside her. She looked at him. He looked at the guns, then at her, then at the wall, and then lay down on the tack room floor with his coat under his head and his arm over his eyes. 3 minutes later, he was asleep. She sat with her back to the wall, the guns at her side, watching the tack room door. Outside, Red Hollow went about its night. A dog barked twice and stopped. Wind came through in a low run and passed on. Somewhere several blocks away, a lamp burned in a second-floor window. 4 days, Henderson's stagecoach on the Redstone Road. Sterling's men in the Narrows. One judge carrying a tin box with a ledger inside it that was either going to change everything in this territory or disappear, the way the copy had disappeared in fire, in water, in the casual destructiveness of a man who'd never once believed anyone would really come for him. Hannah looked at the guns on the floor beside her. She thought about the morning on the ridge, the single shot, the branding iron spinning out of the henchman's hand. Sterling had asked her, at the quarry with his knife, who was going to fire a shot to save her now. She'd been thinking about the answer ever since. The answer was that the shot had already been fired months ago in a sealed tin box under a false floor, in 8 months of careful documentation, in copied pages, and dispatched couriers and women learning to read fine print by lamplight in a homestead kitchen. The shot that mattered wasn't the one that scattered 40 men. It was the one no one saw coming. She kept watch until dawn. They left Red Hollow at dusk the following evening. Jessie rode Smoke. Hannah rode the Roan. They didn't talk much on the way out of town, which was fine because the situation didn't require talking. It required staying off the main road, moving through the brush line on the eastern side, and getting to the Redstone Narrows before Sterling's men finished setting whatever they were setting. The Narrows were 8 miles north. At a steady trot through broken terrain, that was 2 hours. They had darkness on their side, and a sky heavy with cloud cover that kept the moon buried, which was good for staying invisible and less good for reading the ground ahead. Hannah trusted the roan. The roan proved worthy of it, picking her way through the scrub with the same pragmatic competence that seemed to define every animal Jessie had ever been in contact with. An hour out, Jessie pulled up and held his hand flat. She stopped beside him, listened. Horses ahead. She couldn't count them by sound, but it was more than 2. Moving in the same direction, maybe a quarter mile to the west. Sterling's outriders, she thought, positioning themselves. Jessie turned Smoke off their current line, angled them northeast through a dry wash, and came out on a bench of higher ground that ran parallel to the main northern road without touching it. From up here, she could see the road as a pale stripe through the dark brush below. No lanterns. No movement visible yet. The stagecoach wouldn't come through until morning. "How far is the ambush point?" she said, low. "See where the rock face cuts in from the west?" He pointed. She followed his line and found it a dark wall of stone pushing toward the road, narrowing the passage to maybe 20 feet of clear ground. Right there. No room to turn a coach around once you're in it. High ground on the left side. The road bends just past the entry, so the driver can't see what's waiting. She looked at it for a while. How many men does Sterling need to stop a stagecoach? 4, Jessie said. 6 to be certain. He'll send 10. She'd been thinking about this all of yesterday, and through the night she'd spent watching the tack room door. The problem wasn't stopping the ambush. The problem was that they were 2 people, one of them with a bullet wound, less than a week healed, and the ambush was set by 10 professional hired guns in prepared positions. A straight fight was not the answer. "The driver," she said, "if we can reach the stagecoach before it hits the Narrows." "That's the play," Jesse said. "We get ahead of it, flag it down, and Henderson comes through a different way." He looked at her. "There's a southern alternate, longer by 4 miles. Comes into Red Hollow through the creek crossing instead of the main road. Sterling won't have it covered." "Does Henderson know about it?" "He will when we tell him." They moved north through the benchland, staying high, and came around the rock formation from the backside, which put them north of the Narrows and south of the stage road. Here, the ground flattened out, and the road was visible for a long stretch in both directions. They waited. The stagecoach came with the first light. She heard the horses first, then the creak and rattle of the coach itself, then the driver's occasional instruction to the team, calm and practiced. 4 horses pulling a Concord coach, rocking on its leather thoroughbraces. She could see the outline of the driver up top and a man beside him, riding shotgun, rifle across his knees. Jesse rode out to the road and stopped Smoke squarely in the middle of it. The driver saw them and pulled the team back hard. The coach swayed and groaned and stopped 40 yards out. The man riding shotgun had his rifle up immediately. "Easy," Jesse called. He kept his hands visible. "We're not stopping you to rob you. We're stopping you because there are 10 men waiting in the Narrows to do something considerably worse." A long pause. Then the stage door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his 60s, lean and sun-worn, with a judge's bearing that came through even in trail clothes. He stood in the road and looked at Jesse on his horse, and then at Hannah beside him, and then at the Narrows in the distance. "Aaron Henderson," he said. "Jesse Walker," Jesse said. Henderson looked at him for a moment. "I know that name, I expect you do. You're the man who sent me a letter." Henderson reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Not sealed anymore. Read." He looked at it and then at Jesse. 8 months ago. "Delivered to my office in Cheyenne by a courier who said he couldn't stay long enough to answer questions." "That's right. And the package that arrived 3 days ago." Henderson looked at Hannah, the ledger and the letter. "That was you, Hannah Miller?" she said. "Yes." Henderson nodded slowly. He looked at the Narrows again. 10 men, you said. Approximately. We counted horses by sound last night. They've been in position since before midnight." Henderson looked at his driver, who had his own read on the situation, and was already leaning toward the alternate. Hannah could see it in how he held the reins. "There's a southern route," Hannah said. "Creek crossing, 4 miles longer. It brings you into Red Hollow from the west side." "I know the route," Henderson said. He looked back at Jesse. "You'll be there." When I opened the proceedings, it wasn't exactly a question. "We'll be there," Jesse said. Henderson got back in the coach. The driver turned the team not quickly. 4 horses and a loaded Concord don't turn on instinct. But the man knew his work, and they came around in a wide arc and headed back south to catch the creek road. Hannah watched the coach go. Then Jesse said, "Ride." And she understood immediately, because she could already hear it. The Narrows had been quiet, and now they weren't. Someone had been watching the road from a high position and had seen the stagecoach turn. Sterling's men came out of the Narrows at a hard run. Not all 10-4, on fast horses, cutting across the brush to head the stagecoach off before it reached the Creek Road junction. The other 6 were coming from the west side of the rock face, moving to cut Jesse and Hannah off from the road behind them. Hannah kicked the roan into a gallop. Jesse was already moving, angling south and east, not toward the stagecoach, but across the line of the men coming from the Narrows. She understood what he was doing. He was drawing them, giving the stagecoach a cleaner run by making himself the more urgent problem. She pulled the Winchester and rode after him. The next 10 minutes were noise and motion, and the specific, sharp concentration that comes when the only thought that fits in your head is the immediate one. She fired twice at the riders, cutting south to reach the stagecoach, and watched them pull up and redirect. They'd rather deal with the people shooting at them than chase a coach. Good. That was the point. Jesse had two of Sterling's men on him directly, closing fast. She cut right and came up alongside the nearer one, and the look on his face when he registered that the rifle was already up and pointed at him was almost comical. He veered hard to avoid it and went into a stand of sage at speed, which solved that problem somewhat violently. The second rider went for Jesse. Jesse dealt with him the way Jesse dealt with things efficiently and without wasted motion. One shot that took the man's hat off and put a second argument in the dirt at his horse's feet. And the horse had its own opinion about this, which was that it preferred to be somewhere else, and the rider went with it involuntarily. 6 down. One way or another, that left 4 somewhere behind them. Hannah pulled the roan up on a rise and looked back. The 4 remaining riders had pulled short of pursuit. She could see them stopped in a loose group, one of them pointing at the stagecoach tracks, turning south, debating. They didn't follow. She understood why. They'd failed. Sterling's men understood better than anyone what Sterling did with failure, and riding back to report, it was not an attractive option. She watched them turn their horses north, away from Red Hollow, and ride out. She let out a breath. Jesse came up beside her. He was breathing hard, and his left hand was pressed flat against his ribs for a moment before he noticed her noticing and moved it. "Your ribs," she said. "Present," he confirmed. "But so are we." She looked south, where the stagecoach was already a distant shape on the creek road, making steady progress toward Red Hollow. "Henderson has everything," she said. "The ledger, your letter, Tobias's bank records, and 10 witnesses," Jesse said, "to a failed ambush on a circuit judge's stagecoach." She thought about that. The ambush itself was evidence. The men who'd run north instead of reporting back were evidence. Every piece of it was Sterling's signature, written in the language he understood best, which was force. He'd run out of language. She turned the roan south. Jesse rode alongside her. The morning was coming in properly now, the cloud cover breaking up, light moving across the high ground in long, clean angles. Somewhere ahead, Red Hollow was waking up. She thought about Ruth learning to read a contract clause. She thought about Mary Holt, 3 years in Sterling's kitchen, and the look on her face when she'd seen her own name in the ledger and understood for the first time exactly what had been done to her. She thought about what understanding looked like, the particular quality of it. Not anger, not fear, clarity. The specific kind that comes when a person realizes that what they thought was an immovable fact is actually just a lie told often enough to feel permanent. "We should hurry," she said. "We should." Jesse agreed. They rode south toward town at a pace that cost Jesse's ribs more than she liked. And he didn't complain once, and she didn't tell him to slow down because they both understood the order of things. Henderson needed to open those proceedings before Sterling could move, and they needed to be there. Everything else came after. Red Hollow's church was the largest building in town. It sat at the north end of the main street, white-painted wood that had gone gray at the edges from 6 Wyoming winters, a simple cross above the door, and a bell that the Reverend rang for every occasion, from Sunday service to fire. Today he'd rung it 9 times, which was not a Sunday count and not a fire count, and everyone in town knew it because everyone in town had been expecting something to happen and could feel that it had. By the time Hannah and Jesse rode in, there were people on the street they'd never seen come into town on a weekday. Farmers from the Eastern Creek properties. 2 women Hannah recognized from Sterling's network who'd never managed to get to Evelyn's homestead, standing together at the edge of the crowd with the specific wariness of people who weren't sure yet whether this was safe. A group of men outside the livery who watched everything with their arms crossed and said nothing. Evelyn was on the church steps. She spotted Hannah first, and the look she gave her was the look of a woman who had spent 3 days not knowing and had managed that not knowing by staying busy and not showing it to anyone. She came down the steps and gripped Hannah's arm. "You're alive," she said. "I said I'd come back," Hannah said. Evelyn looked at Jessie behind her. "Both of you." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She let go of Hannah's arm and turned back toward the church. "Henderson's been in there for an hour. He arrived this morning. He wanted to start immediately." She glanced back. "He said he had everything he needed and would wait no longer than necessary for witnesses." They tied the horses and went inside. The church was full, not every seat, but most of them. People sat close together the way they do when the occasion is larger than comfort, and nobody wants to be the one standing apart from it. Hannah walked down the center aisle and felt eyes on her, and she kept her chin level and her pace steady because she had nothing to be ashamed of and intended to look like it. Judge Aaron Henderson sat at a table that had been placed where the pulpit normally stood, which felt appropriate in ways Hannah didn't think through too carefully. He had his traveling box open on the table in front of him, which was the iron box she'd heard about from Jessie's letter. She could see the corner of the ledger inside it. He looked up when she entered and gave a brief nod. Sterling was seated to the left, near the front between two of his remaining men. He was still dressed well, still the cream-colored shirt, still the silver watch chain. He was not handcuffed, not yet. Henderson had clearly not yet gotten to that part. Sterling's eyes found Hannah when she walked in. She watched his face make the calculation. He'd been told she escaped. He'd known Jessie might still be alive. But seeing them both here, in this room, with Henderson's iron box open on the table, she watched him do the arithmetic and arrive at a number he didn't like. She took a seat on the right side, third row. Jessie sat beside her. His shoulder was against hers. She didn't move away. Henderson stood. He didn't need a gavel to get the room quiet. He just stood, and the room understood that something was beginning. "This is not a formal trial," he said. His voice was the kind that carried without effort, dry and precise, as a good contract. "I don't have the authority to conduct one in this setting. What I have is the authority, as a circuit judge of this territory, to review documentary evidence, hear testimony, issue preliminary findings, and determine whether the matter requires transfer to a territorial court. It does." He paused. "That determination is already made. What follows is the record." He opened the iron box and lifted the ledger out. He set it on the table. The room was very quiet. "This document," Henderson said, "was delivered to my office 4 days ago, accompanied by a letter signed by Hannah Miller. It has been compared against a separate written account delivered to my office 8 months prior by Jessie Walker, and against financial records provided by a third party, Tobias Marsh, who has agreed to serve as a cooperative witness." He looked at the room over the top of his glasses. "The documents are consistent with each other. They describe a systematic scheme of fraudulent debt generation, enforced labor, and bribery of county officials, conducted over a period not less than 12 years, originating with Sterling Montgomery." Sterling said something to the man beside him. Low. Henderson looked at him. "You'll have an opportunity to speak," Henderson said, "when I'm ready for you." Sterling went quiet. Hannah looked at Tobias, who was seated near the back. He was turned slightly sideways in his seat, not looking at Sterling. His daughter, Anna, was beside him, and she was holding his arm with both hands, and Tobias was holding himself very still in the way of a man who has made a decision he can't take back and is finding out what that feels like. Henderson called Hannah first. She stood and walked to the front of the room and turned to face it, and she was not afraid. She had not been afraid since the quarry, which she found interesting. Fear had been replaced somewhere in the last several days by something else, something harder and quieter that didn't have a clean name, but felt like bedrock. She told it from the beginning. Her father's contract, the language in the penalty clauses, the way the interest was structured to grow faster than any honest labor could repay it. She told it without anger and without performance because the facts were sufficient, and she respected the room enough to give it the facts. She told them about 5 years, about the women she'd worked alongside, About learning to read the ledger itself, one column at a time, in secret, at night, until the whole picture resolved. She told them what the picture was. When she finished, she looked at Sterling directly. He was looking back at her with the controlled expression of a man who has not yet given up the idea that he can still manage this. The contracts Sterling used, she said, were written to be unreadable to the people signing them. Not because contracts have to be complicated, because he needed them to be complicated. The moment any one of those women could read it clearly, the moment they understood what the words actually meant, the entire system failed. He was not selling labor agreements. He was selling ignorance. Counting on it, building 12 years of wealth on the assumption that people wouldn't be able to read what had been done to them. She paused. That assumption was wrong. She went back to her seat. Henderson called two more witnesses, Mary Holt, who described 3 years in Sterling's kitchen, and the debt that grew no matter what she paid. A man named Garrett, who'd lost 40 acres of the Eastern Creek land to a recorded seizure that he now understood had been processed through the bot recorder. Henderson reviewed the bank records from Tobias's folio. He read specific entries into the record, dates, amounts, names. The sheriff's name, the recorder's name, Judge Carver, of the lower circuit, whose name produced a ripple through the room. Then Henderson looked at Sterling. "Do you wish to make a statement?" he said. Sterling stood. He straightened his coat, adjusted the watch chain. He looked at the room with the expression of a man deciding which version of the truth he wanted to try. "These documents," he said, "were obtained through illegal means. They were stolen from private property by a woman under a legitimate labor contract who had no legal standing to access my personal business records, whatever they purport to show." "Mr. Montgomery," Henderson said. Sterling stopped. "The legality of how evidence was obtained is a matter for the territorial court to consider. It is not a matter I'm ruling on this morning." Henderson looked at him steadily. "What I am ruling on is whether the evidence, considered together, establishes reasonable grounds for a territorial proceeding. It does, unambiguously." He picked up a pen and wrote something in the record book on the table. "I am further issuing, as of this moment, a stay on all property transfer proceedings filed in Red Hollow County in the last 30 days, pending review by the territorial court." A sound went through the room, not loud, more like a collective exhale. 30 people releasing something they'd been holding without knowing it. "That is not within your," Sterling began. "It is precisely within my authority," Henderson said. He set the pen down. He looked at Sterling the way a man looks at something he's been asked to assess and has assessed. "Sterling Montgomery, you will be held in the custody of the Territorial Marshal's Office pending transfer. You are charged with fraud, coercion, and bribery of public officials. The territorial court will determine additional charges." He picked up a small wooden block, which was not a proper gavel, but served the same purpose, and set it firmly against the table. "The fraudulent debts documented in this ledger are declared null and void pending confirmation by the territorial court, which I anticipate will be a short proceeding, given the documentation before us." He looked at the room. The law in this territory exists to protect fairness, not to serve as a tool for wealthy men to trade human beings like livestock. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Sterling Montgomery, your greatest crime isn't fraud. It's your utter contempt for human dignity." Silence. Then someone in the back started clapping. It wasn't the polished applause of a gathered audience. It was the sound of a person whose hands had started moving before they'd made a decision to do it. One person, and then another, and then it spread through the room in a disorganized and completely genuine wave. Sterling's face did something Hannah hadn't seen on it before. The controlled expression broke. What was underneath it was not pleasant to look at, but she looked at it anyway, because she'd spent 5 years not being allowed to look at him directly, and she intended to spend exactly as much time as she wanted doing it. Now, 2 men from the territorial marshal's office. Henderson had brought them, which suggested he'd anticipated this outcome, moved to either side of Sterling and took his arms. The watch chain caught the light as they turned him. Someone produced iron cuffs, which closed around his wrists with a sound that carried in the quiet church. Hannah watched him walk up the center aisle toward the door. He didn't look at her as he passed. She looked at him. Jessie was beside her, still and quiet. She felt his hand find hers, not grabbing, just present, fingers settling between hers, the way something returns to where it's supposed to be. She held on. Mary Holt was crying in the row ahead of them, not trying to hide it. Evelyn was not crying, because Evelyn had apparently made other arrangements, but she was standing very straight, with her eyes bright and her chin up in the manner of a person receiving something they'd waited for long enough to stop expecting it. Tobias sat in the back with his daughter's hand on his arm and stared at the floor with the complicated expression of a man in the process of weighing what he'd done wrong against what he'd finally done right. Hannah thought he'd be all right. Not immediately, but eventually. Some debts were real, and some could be worked down honestly. Ruth came through the door near the end. She'd been outside with her children, Hannah realized, not wanting to bring them in until it was clear how it was going to go. She came in now and stopped just inside the door and looked at Hannah with a question in her face. Hannah looked back at her and nodded. Ruth closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she opened them and squared her shoulders and went to find a seat. Henderson was writing in the record book, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the church now. The proceedings were technically concluded. The crowd was beginning to move, people standing, turning to each other, the low hum of a town processing a change it had needed for a long time. Hannah sat until the room thinned out. Jesse sat beside her and didn't try to move the moment along. He had that particular gift, rare in anyone, and rare in men who operated the way he'd always operated, of understanding when sitting still was the right action. She thought about her father, signing something he couldn't read because he was too proud to say so. She thought about the specific moment she'd first understood that contract. The night in Sterling's kitchen, when the column of figures had finally resolved, when the language on page 3 had parsed into its actual meaning, and she'd sat for a full minute with the paper in her hand and just understood. She thought about how she'd felt in that moment. Not angry. Not immediately. The anger had come later. The first feeling had been clarity. Sharp and cold, and completely without mercy, like water from the river at high elevation. This is what was done. This is what it means. This is how it works. Understanding wasn't a comfort. It didn't make the 5 years any shorter or give her father back, but it was the thing that made action possible. It was the thing Sterling had spent 12 years preventing, and it was the thing that had undone him. She looked at the ledger on Henderson's table. He'd left it open when he'd gone to speak with the marshals in the back. Pages of Sterling's own careful handwriting, columns and figures, and the names of people he'd believed would never be able to read what he'd done to them. She stood. Jesse stood beside her. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She meant it. "I'm all right." She walked to the back of the church, and Jesse walked with her, and the day outside was bright and cold, and everything was different now from how it had been when she'd walked in. 3 months changed the look of things. The building that became Bennett Legal Aid had been an unused grain storage room on the east side of Red Hollow's Main Street, owned by a man named Garrett, who gave Hannah the use of it for $1 per year because he said that was what was fair, and he intended to act accordingly. She'd spent the first 2 weeks scrubbing the floor and repairing the 2 windows and building a proper shelf along the north wall from boards she sourced from the mill. The sign was Jesse's work, technically. He'd cut the letters himself from a plank of good pine. She'd painted them. They'd disagreed on the spacing and come to a reasonable arrangement about it, which was the nature of how they'd been doing things. The name on the sign said Bennett Legal Aid and Literacy, because when Hannah had described what she wanted, the legal assistance piece, And the reading instruction piece, Evelyn had said those were two different words, and both needed to be on the sign. And Hannah had agreed. Bennett was her mother's maiden name. Her mother had been able to read, and had taught Hannah her letters before anything else. And Hannah thought it was the right name for a place where reading was the point. The office opened on a Tuesday in November. Ruth came first, because Ruth arrived first to everything, a habit developed from years of needing to demonstrate cooperative behavior to employers who didn't wish her well. She came in with her two children and set them in the corner with a primer. Hannah had sourced from Cheyenne, and then she sat down at the table and said she wanted to understand property law. Hannah got out the relevant documents and started talking. By the end of the first week, they had 9 regular students and 4 women who'd come in for legal consultations regarding debts they were now, thanks to Henderson's territorial court ruling, legally entitled to contest. The ruling had come through 6 weeks after the church tribunal. Sterling's fraudulent contracts were void. The property seizures were reversed. The county recorder had resigned and been replaced, and the territorial court was in the process of investigating Judge Carver of the lower circuit, which was a separate and lengthy proceeding that Hannah monitored but left to the lawyers. There were lawyers now, real ones, from Cheyenne, 2 of them, who'd taken the case pro bono, because Henderson had written them a letter that apparently made the situation clear. Anna Marsh came in on the 3rd week. She was 17 and had her father's round glasses and a quickness that showed immediately when Hannah put a contract in front of her and started explaining the structure. Tobias had sent her with a note, said that she understands numbers better than I do, which turned out to be true. She became Hannah's second assistant after Evelyn, who made the trip from her homestead twice a week and taught the older students herself, because she'd been a school teacher 40 years ago in Ohio and had not forgotten how. The work wasn't simple. Understanding a contract was one piece. Understanding your rights under territorial law was another. Understanding what to do when a creditor presented fraudulent terms, or an employer withheld wages, or a land deed was recorded incorrectly. Those were separate problems, each with their own shape, and Hannah worked through them one at a time with whoever came through the door. She wasn't a lawyer. She was clear about that with everyone who came in. She could teach, she could explain, she could sit beside someone and read a document through with them and help them understand what it said and what it didn't say and what questions to ask. When something required actual legal action, she connected them to the Cheyenne lawyers. But she'd learned in 5 years in Sterling's household that most of what he'd counted on was the gap between a document and a person's understanding of it. Close that gap and the entire mechanism failed. You didn't always need a lawyer first. Sometimes you needed someone to sit down and read the words alongside you and say, "Here, this is what this means." That was what the office was for. Jesse's ranch was a half-mile out of town on the southern road. He'd found the property in September, 10 acres of flat grass backing up against a limestone ridge with a creek on the eastern edge and enough natural shelter from the north wind that horses could winter without much additional structure. He'd put the first fence posts in while Hannah was still scrubbing the grain room floor, and they'd occasionally met in the evenings to eat something and discuss their respective construction problems, which was a form of companionship that suited them both. The governor's pardon had come through in October. Jesse had held the document for a long time, without saying anything, which was how he processed most things that mattered. Then he'd folded it and put it in his coat pocket and asked her if she wanted coffee. She'd said yes. He'd stopped wearing the guns the week the pardon came through. Not stopped entirely. They were in the cabin, within reach, and she suspected always would be, because some things don't fully untrain. But he stopped wearing them as daily equipment, the way he'd worn them since she'd met him. He'd hung the gun belt on a hook inside the door and started wearing just his coat, and the first time, She'd noticed the absence of it. She hadn't said anything, but she'd noticed. He worked with the horses the way he'd worked with everything else, quietly, systematically, with the patient consistency of a man who understood that trust between a person and an animal was built in small increments and couldn't be rushed. He had 4 horses in October and 9 in November, and had turned down 2 additional horses he felt weren't ready to be worked yet, which she thought was the most Jesse Walker decision she'd encountered. On a Tuesday morning, in late November, 3 months and 1 week after the church tribunal, Hannah closed the office at noon. She'd been doing this lately, taking a midday hour when the morning sessions ended, and the afternoon hadn't begun, just for herself, because the work was real and full, and she'd learned slowly to stop treating rest as a luxury she hadn't earned. She rode the roan south out of town. Jesse's fence line was visible from the road. He'd gotten the southern pasture, mostly enclosed now, the posts straight and the wire taut. And the sight of it, the simple evidence of work done carefully, gave her something she didn't have a word for, but recognized when it arrived. He was in the near pasture with a gray mare she hadn't seen before, moving in slow circles. The horse was young, nervous, not yet willing to trust the person in the middle of the circle. Jesse was not trying to force it. He was just present, consistent, letting the horse decide in its own time. He'd been doing this with the same mare for 3 days. He looked up when she came through the gate. She tied the roan and came to the fence rail and leaned on it and watched. He didn't stop what he was doing. She didn't expect him to. The gray mare made another circle. Then she slowed. Then she turned her head toward Jesse and stopped moving. He waited. She took a step toward him. He held still. 2 more steps, and then the mare pushed her nose into his chest, and his hand came up and rested between her ears, and he stood like that for a long time, without moving. Hannah watched from the fence. He came over when the mare had moved off to graze. He rested his forearms on the top rail beside her. They stood looking at the pasture, the grass pale and dry, in the November light, the limestone ridge catching the noon sun at a low angle. "How's the office?" he said. "Full," she said. "Evelyn has the afternoon. Ruth's daughter came in this morning for the first time." He nodded. "I had 3 contract consultations yesterday," she said. 2 of them were situations Sterling wouldn't have been involved in at all. Just regular agreements with bad terms that people hadn't known to question. "That's the point," he said. "That's the point," she agreed. She looked at the gray mare. "What's her name?" "Haven't decided." "How long does it usually take you?" "Until it's clear," he said. She accepted this. It was a complete answer in his language. A hawk was working the updraft over the ridge, riding it without effort, the way hawks do when they've found exactly the right angle. The sun was clean and direct, and the air smelled of dry grass and cold stone and faintly of the pine line above the ridge. She thought about the last time she'd stood in an open field and felt nothing but the field. She couldn't locate it. Before her father's death. Certainly, before she'd understood what the world was capable of, which was both worse and better than she'd known at the start. Worse in the ways Sterling had shown her. Better in the ways this fall had shown her. Jesse turned so his back was against the rail, looking at the cabin and the fence line and the horses moving in the south pasture. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "Clara would have liked this," he said. "The office. What you're doing there." He looked at the pasture. She was a practical person. She'd have had opinions about the sign lettering. Hannah smiled. "The spacing." "The spacing," he agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Tell me something about her," Hannah said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the guarded quiet of someone unwilling, the thoughtful quiet of someone choosing. "She made terrible coffee," he said. "And she knew it, and she made it anyway every morning. And she'd pour you a cup with this completely straight face like she was daring you to say something." He paused. She'd learned the names of every constellation by the time she was 14. She could find any one of them in under a minute from anywhere, any season. She used to say that navigation was just remembering what you'd already been shown. Hannah looked at the ridge. Navigation is just remembering what you'd already been shown, she said. Yeah, he looked at the sky, not searching it, just looking. I think about that sometimes. Whether this the ledger, the office, Henderson, all of it. Whether this is what being shown looks like. She turned and looked at him. He was still looking at the sky, and his profile against the November light was the profile of a man who had stopped running something and had not yet named what he'd started doing instead. She thought she knew what it was. She thought he knew, too. He was careful with words the way he was careful with most things. And she respected that. She turned back to the pasture. I have 4 women coming in tomorrow morning, she said. All 4 of them left similar situations in different places. 2 came from properties an hour north. 1 came from as far as the Colorado border. Word's traveling, he said. It travels fast when people have been needing somewhere to go. She folded her hands on the rail. I need a second table. For the consultations. I've been doing them all at the same table as the reading lessons, and it's getting crowded. I can build you a table, he said. I know you can. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a long pause of the kind that doesn't need filling. I'm going to need more books, she said, for the literacy classes. Evelyn has primers, but they're basic. I want to get to contracts, legal language, property terminology, things people actually encounter. Cheyenne has a bookseller, Jessie said. I'm riding up next week for lumber. If you have room in the wagon, I'll make room, he said. She nodded. He nodded. The gray mare moved across the pasture with her ears half forward, interested in something in the grass. Hannah straightened off the rail. She had an afternoon session to get back for, and Evelyn could handle the start of it, but the contract work was hers to do. She untied the roan and put her foot in the stirrup. Jessie came around the fence. He stopped beside her and looked up at her, already in the saddle. The afternoon light put his scar in shadow and made his eyes very steady. There's something I want to say, he said. She waited. I came to Wyoming to even an account I already knew. I couldn't even, he said. That was the honest truth of it, even when I was telling myself it was about the system, about stopping the next Sterling. He put his hand on the roan's neck. Both things were true. That can happen, she said. Don't want to just even accounts anymore. He looked at the hand on the roan's neck and then back at her. I want to build something. I want the horses and the fence line and the table I'm going to build for your office and the books from Cheyenne. I want to see what comes after, the part I know how to do. He paused. I want to see what comes after with you, specifically, if that's the thing you want. She looked at him for a moment. Jessie Walker, she said, you rode down a hill and scattered 40 men and pulled me up from the dirt and drove off a cliff into a frozen river. You sat up 3 nights with a bullet in you helping me figure out how to save a stagecoach. She held his gaze. I think I have established that I want to be in the same general location as you. He was quiet for a second. That's a yes? That's a yes, she said. He almost smiled. This time she was close enough to see it fully. It changed his whole face. She turned the roan toward town and started back, and after a moment she heard him behind her, following on Smoke because he'd decided to ride in with her and hadn't said anything about it, just done it. They rode south together in the November light, and the town came into view below the ridge, the church, the main street, the East Side building, with the new pine sign in the window. And it looked like itself, like a place where something had happened, and people were still here afterward, doing the work of being here. Hannah's gun had saved her once from a branding iron. Jessie's shot had started everything. But the thing that had actually won the ledger, and the copies, and the lamplight, and the women learning to read, Tobias's bank records and Cal's early morning ride north, and Henderson's iron box, and the words spoken out loud in a full church on a cold morning, that was something else. That was information moving freely through the hands of people who had been told it didn't belong to them. That was the thing Sterling couldn't stop, no matter how many men he had, or how much he paid, or how many fires he built. You couldn't burn what was already known. You couldn't seal a door that had already opened. Hannah had spent 5 years learning his language, and then she'd used it against him, word by word, clause by clause, in the clear, unsparing American English of a woman who had decided that understanding was not a gift you waited to receive, but a right you went and got for yourself. She rode into town with the man who'd fired one shot and changed the course of everything, and she was free, and she knew what that meant now in a way she hadn't when she was simply not yet caught. Freedom wasn't the absence of chains. It was knowing the words, reading the contract, understand had been done, and what could be done, and who you were, when nobody was telling you otherwise. She'd learned that. She intended to spend a long time teaching it. Hannah Miller didn't win because she had a faster gun. She won because she learned to read the contract. That's the quiet truth at the heart of this story, and it hits harder than any gunshot in it. Sterling Montgomery built his empire not on brute force alone, but on a single, devastating assumption that the people he preyed upon would never understand what had been done to them. He buried his crimes in fine print. He weaponized language itself, legal clauses, compounding interest, words that looked like agreements but were really traps. And for years it worked, because when people don't have access to information, when they can't read what they're signing, when no one explains what the words actually mean, they are vulnerable in a way that no amount of courage can fully protect them from. Jesse Walker rode down that hill with twin revolvers and scattered 40 men. But even Jesse knew that wasn't enough. You can clear a yard. You can't clear a system with bullets. Every sterling has a replacement. Every price has a successor. The vacancy fills. The ledger gets rewritten. And the cycle starts again unless something more fundamental changes. What changed it was the ledger itself. Copied, distributed, spoken aloud in a full church on a cold morning. What changed it was Hannah sitting across a table from women who wept because they didn't understand what they'd signed, and deciding that understanding was not a privilege to be granted, but a right to be taught. What changed it was information moving freely through the hands of people who had been told it didn't belong to them. That is the story's deepest argument. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's knowing the words, reading the contract, understanding what has been done to you and what you can do about it. Hannah spent years learning Sterling's language, and then she turned it against him, clause by clause, in the clear, unsparing language of a woman who had decided she was done waiting for permission to understand her own life. There's something in that for all of us, not just in the American West of a century and a half ago, but right now, in the world we actually live in. The people who hold power over others rarely do it with branding irons anymore. They do it with complexity, with fine print, with systems designed to be just confusing enough that most people give up trying to understand them. The antidote is the same one Hannah found. Go get the words. Learn the language. Find the table where someone is willing to sit across from you and explain what the contract actually says. And if you happen to meet a man with a scar on his jaw who fires one shot and changes everything, well, hold on tight and don't let go. Jesse Walker came to Wyoming to even an account. He stayed to build something. That shift from vengeance to construction, from evening the score to laying the foundation, is maybe the most human arc in the entire story. Grief is a powerful engine, but it burns out. What sustains a person, what sustains a community, is the slower and harder work of building what should have existed in the first place. Hannah knew that. By the end, Jesse did too. They rode into town together in the November light, and the town looked like itself, a place where something terrible had happened, and people were still there, doing the work of being there. That image stays with you, because that's what most of us are doing, in our own way, in our own towns. Showing up after the hard thing, doing the work of being here. This story was set in the Wyoming Territory, but the ground it stands on is timeless. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, locations, and organizations depicted are entirely fictional and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or places, is purely coincidental. The historical setting is used as a literary backdrop only and is not intended as an accurate representation of any specific historical period, legal system, or community. The views and actions of characters within this story do not reflect the views of the author or publisher. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only.